I was sitting in Dr. Harrison's office, in that uncomfortable leather chair that squeaks every time you move, when my daughter Rebecca leaned forward with tears in her eyes and said in the most concerned voice I'd ever heard from her, "Doctor, I'm really worried about Mom. She's been forgetting things, leaving the stove on, getting confused about dates. I think she might have dementia." And I watched Dr. Harrison's face shift from professional curiosity to serious concern as he turned to me and asked, "Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, have you been experiencing any memory problems?" And I looked at Rebecca, saw that perfect performance of a concerned daughter, and something inside me, some instinct I'd developed over 68 years of life, told me to play along, so I smiled vaguely and said, "Well, I do forget things sometimes, doesn't everyone at my age?" And Rebecca jumped in immediately. "See, doctor, she doesn't even realize how bad it's gotten. Last week she forgot my birthday, and she's been asking me the same questions multiple times, and every word out of her mouth was a carefully crafted lie. Because my birthday calendar was perfectly maintained, I'd sent her a card and a check for $200, and I never repeated questions because I've always had a sharp memory, sharper than most people half my age. But I sat there, playing the confused elderly woman, because something about the gleam in Rebecca's eyes, something about the way she'd insisted on coming to this appointment with me, had triggered every alarm bell in my head. Dr. Harrison ran some basic cognitive tests, asked me to remember 3 words and repeat them later, asked me to draw a clock, asked me about the current president, and I deliberately got a few things wrong. Not too many, just enough to seem concerningly forgetful, and all the while Rebecca sat there with that mask of loving concern, and when Dr. Harrison finally said, "Mrs. Blackwood, I think we should run some more comprehensive tests, and in the meantime, it might be good if someone helped. You manage your finances and important decisions." I saw it, that flash of triumph in Rebecca's eyes that she tried to hide behind fake tears, and that's when I knew with absolute certainty that my only daughter, the child I'd raised alone after her father died, the girl I'd put through college by working 2 jobs, the woman I'd helped buy her first house, was trying to have me declared mentally incompetent so she could get control of my money. I left that appointment with a prescription for preliminary tests and a follow-up in 2 weeks, and Rebecca drove me home in my own car, the BMW I'd bought myself after selling my consulting business, and she talked the whole way about how she'd take care of everything, and how I shouldn't worry about bills or paperwork anymore. And I just nodded and smiled like a confused old lady, but inside my mind was racing, calculating, planning, because if there's one thing I learned from 35 years as a corporate litigation consultant, it's that you never confront your opponent until you have ironclad evidence of their intentions. That night, after Rebecca left, I sat in my study, the room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal texts and business journals, and I took out the small digital voice recorder I'd used for decades to record strategy sessions and client meetings, the one that could capture crystal-clear audio from across a room, and I tested it, checked the battery life, made sure the memory card had plenty of space, and I smiled to myself because Rebecca had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated her mother. The next morning, Rebecca called at 8 a.m., which was unusual because she typically never called before noon, and she said in that syrupy voice, "Mom, I've been thinking maybe I should move in with you for a while, just to help out, with the memory issues." And I replied, "Oh, sweetie, that's so thoughtful, but I'm managing fine." And she pushed back, "But Mom, what if you forget to take your medications or leave the stove on? I'd never forgive myself if something happened." And I could hear it in her voice, that urgency, that need to get into my house and my life, so I said, "Well, if you think it's necessary," and she practically shouted, "Great, I'll bring some things over this weekend." And I knew I'd just set the perfect trap. Rebecca moved into my guest bedroom that Saturday, arriving with 3 large suitcases and a laptop, and she immediately started going through my mail, asking about my bank accounts, inquiring about my investment portfolio, and every time she asked a question, I played the role perfectly. I'd pause as if trying to remember, I'd give vague answers, I'd ask her to help me find documents that I knew exactly where they were. And all the while, that little voice recorder was hidden in a decorative book on the shelf, recording every single conversation, every manipulation, every lie. On the 3rd day of her stay, Rebecca called someone on her phone, and I pretended to be napping in my chair while I actually listened intently as she said, Yeah, Dr. Harrison is going to do a full cognitive assessment next week, and I've already talked to a lawyer about getting power of attorney. Once she's declared incompetent, everything transfers to me, the house, the investments, all of it. And then Mark and I can finally buy that lake house we've been wanting. And my blood ran cold. Because Mark was her husband, a man I'd never particularly liked, a man who'd always looked at my possessions with greedy eyes. And now I understood this wasn't just Rebecca's plan, it was both of theirs. They'd calculated this together, probably for months, waiting for the right moment to execute their scheme. I kept playing along, and Rebecca's behavior became more blatant. She started bringing her lawyer to the house, a sleazy-looking man named Gordon Pike who smiled too much and kept asking me to sign papers, just to make things easier. And each time I'd look confused and say, "I should probably read these first," and Rebecca would jump in with, "Mom, it's just standard stuff, you trust me, don't you?" And I'd hesitate just long enough to make them think I was on the edge of signing, but I never did. I always found some excuse. "I need my reading glasses, I'm too tired right now, let me think about it overnight," and I could see their frustration growing, but they had to maintain the charade of loving concern. The follow-up appointment with Dr. Harrison came 2 weeks later, and Rebecca made sure to arrive early, to speak with him privately before I came in, and I let her think I didn't notice. But I'd already called Dr. Harrison's office myself 3 days earlier, speaking to him directly, explaining that I was perfectly lucid and that I suspected my daughter was fabricating symptoms to gain control of my finances. And Dr. Harrison, who'd known me for 15 years and had always commented on my sharp mind, listened carefully and agreed to conduct a proper, thorough evaluation. When we sat in his office for the comprehensive assessment, Rebecca was there with her concerned expression, and Dr. Harrison put me through every cognitive test in the book. Memory recall, spatial reasoning, problem-solving, language skills, executive function tests, and I aced every single one, performing at a level that would be impressive for someone 30 years younger. And I watched Rebecca's face progressively fall as Dr. Harrison took detailed notes, and when he finally said, "Mrs. Blackwood, your cognitive function is excellent. There's absolutely no sign of dementia or any other cognitive impairment," Rebecca actually gasped and said, "But doctor, at home she's so confused, maybe she's just having a good day." And Dr. Harrison looked at her with newfound suspicion and replied, "Ms. Mitchell, these tests are specifically designed to catch inconsistencies, and your mother shows no signs of the cognitive decline you've described. In fact, her results are in the 95th percentile for her age group." And that's when Rebecca's mask slipped, just for a moment, and I saw the anger flash across her face before she recovered and said, "Well, maybe I was mistaken, maybe I was just being overly worried." And Dr. Harrison said, "Perhaps," but his tone suggested he didn't believe her at all. We left the office in silence, and on the drive home, Rebecca tried to salvage the situation, saying things like, "Well, thank God you're okay, Mom, I was so worried." But her voice was tight, strained, and I could practically hear her recalculating her plans. And when we got home, she immediately went to her room and I heard her on the phone, her voice rising in frustration as she said, "The doctor says she's fine, completely fine. He said her mind is perfect, so now what do we do?" And I stood outside her door, holding my voice recorder, capturing every word, and the voice on the other end, Mark's voice, said, "We need to push harder, make her seem more confused, maybe stage some incidents, make the neighbors think she's losing it." And Rebecca replied, "Like what?" And Mark said, "I don't know, maybe she leaves the stove on and almost burns the house down, or she wanders outside in her nightgown. Something that makes it clear she can't take care of herself." And they were actually planning to sabotage me, to create false evidence of incompetence. And I stood there in my hallway, in the house I'd worked 40 years to own, listening to my daughter and her husband plot against me, and something hardened in my chest, something that transformed my hurt into cold, calculated determination. That night, I called my own lawyer, a woman named Patricia Thornton who I'd known since we worked together at Morrison and Associates, and I told her everything, played her the recordings, and Patricia listened with increasing anger and said, "Eleanor, what they're planning isn't just unethical, it's illegal. This is elder abuse, attempted fraud, conspiracy to commit financial exploitation." And we spent 3 hours that night planning a counter-strategy, and Patricia said, "You need more evidence. We need to document everything, every conversation, every attempt to manipulate you, every false statement they make to medical professionals or financial institutions, and then will bring it all to light in a way that ensures they face real consequences. The next morning, Rebecca announced she needed to go to the bank with me to help organize my accounts, and I agreed, playing my role. And at the bank, she tried to add herself to my accounts as a co-signer, telling the bank manager, "My mother's memory isn't what it used to be. I need to be able to help her manage things." And the bank manager, Mr. Chun, who'd handled my accounts for 20 years, looked at me and asked, "Mrs. Blackwood, is this what you want?" And I looked confused and said, "Well, I suppose if Rebecca thinks it's necessary." And I watched Rebecca's face light up with victory, but what she didn't see was the slight shake of my head I gave Mr. Chun, a gesture he understood immediately, and he said, "Actually, for a change this significant, we require a full capacity assessment from an independent evaluator. It's bank policy for accounts of this size." And Rebecca's face fell as Mr. Chun continued, "We'll need to schedule that for next week, and Mrs. Blackwood will need to come in alone for the evaluation." And Rebecca tried to argue, "But I'm her daughter, I should be there." And Mr. Chun replied firmly, "Bank policy, I'm afraid. The evaluation must be conducted with the account holder alone." And I could have kissed him for his professional integrity. Over the next 2 weeks, Rebecca's attempts became increasingly desperate. She tried to schedule appointments with my investment advisor. She called my insurance company claiming I needed her added as a beneficiary. She even contacted my attorney trying to discuss my will, and each time, I'd alerted these people in advance, explaining the situation, and each time, they protected my interests and documented her attempts, building a paper trail of her manipulation. Then came the incident Rebecca and Mark had planned, the one I'd overheard them discussing, and one evening, Rebecca deliberately left the stove on after cooking dinner, turned it on high with an empty pot, and then took a long shower, clearly hoping I wouldn't notice until smoke filled the house. But I'd been expecting something like this, so I'd been watching, and the moment she went upstairs, I turned off the stove, opened the windows, and set up my video camera, another tool from my corporate days, positioned to show the stove and the timestamp, and then I waited, and 20 minutes later, Rebecca came downstairs, saw the stove was off, and I watched confusion cross her face as she looked around, trying to figure out what had happened, and I pretended to be dozing in my chair, and she actually went over and turned the stove back on, turned it up to high with that empty pot, and then she grabbed her phone and stepped outside. And that's when I knew she was calling someone, probably Mark or a neighbor, to discover the fire hazard. So I got up, turned off the stove again, and this time I stayed in the kitchen, and when Rebecca came back in with our neighbor Mrs. Patterson, both of them stopped dead when they saw me standing there calmly making tea, and Rebecca said, "Mom, were you just cooking something?" And I replied, "No, dear, I was just making tea, why?" And she looked at the stove, saw it was off and cool, and I could see the panic in her eyes as she realized her plan had failed, and Mrs. Patterson looked between us, clearly confused, and said, "Rebecca, you called me saying your mother left the stove on and there was smoke." And I turned to Rebecca with a perfect expression of concern and said, "Oh, sweetie, are you feeling all right? You seem stressed lately, maybe you should see a doctor." And the irony wasn't lost on anyone, and Mrs. Patterson left looking distinctly uncomfortable. And Rebecca went to her room, and I heard her crying, not tears of sadness but tears of frustration, and I almost felt sorry for her, but then I remembered the recordings I had of her and Mark planning to institutionalize me, planning to declare me mentally incompetent, planning to take everything I'd worked for, and my sympathy evaporated. During this entire ordeal, I started noticing other disturbing patterns in Rebecca's behavior that I'd somehow missed over the years, or perhaps had chosen not to see, like the way she'd always asked about my finances during family gatherings, questions that seemed innocent at the time. "How's your investment portfolio doing, Mom?" Or, "That's a nice necklace, is it valuable?" And I realized she'd been cataloging my assets for years, probably since her father died, and she understood she'd be the sole inheritor. And this realization made me wonder when exactly I'd lost my daughter. Was it gradual, a slow erosion of values I'd tried to instill in her, or was it sudden, perhaps when she married Mark and his materialistic worldview infected her thinking, or maybe, and this was the most painful thought, maybe she'd always been this way and I'd been too blinded by maternal love to see it. I remembered a conversation we'd had 5 years ago, right after I sold my consulting business for a substantial sum, Rebecca had come over with champagne to celebrate, but spent the entire evening asking detailed questions about the sale price, the terms, what I planned to do with the money, and when I'd mentioned I was thinking of donating a significant portion to charity, specifically to organizations that helped women start businesses, Rebecca's face had fallen and she'd said, "But Mom, shouldn't you think about family first? I mean, what if you need that money later, or what if I need help with something?" And I'd laughed it off, assuring her I had plenty for both charity and family, never realizing that what I'd interpreted as concern for my financial security was actually concern about her future inheritance being diminished. The memory stung now, sitting in my study at 2 a.m, unable to sleep, listening to another recording I'd made that day of Rebecca on the phone with Mark, and this conversation was perhaps the most damaging yet because Rebecca said, "I've been thinking, maybe we should speed this up. What if she actually does donate everything to charity before we can get control? What if she changes her will?" And Mark replied, "That's why we need to move fast. Once we have power of attorney, we can block any attempts she makes to change financial arrangements. We can claim she's not competent to make those decisions, and even if she's already changed her will, we can contest it based on her supposed mental decline." And Rebecca laughed, actually laughed, and said, "It's almost too easy. She trusts me completely. She has no idea what's coming." And hearing my daughter laugh about betraying me, about stealing my autonomy and my life's work, made something crack inside my chest. Not my heart breaking, but rather my last illusion about who Rebecca truly was shattering into irreparable pieces. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my son-in-law Mark directly, something I rarely did because we'd never been close, and I said in my best confused elderly voice, "Mark, dear, Rebecca mentioned something about papers I need to sign, but I can't quite remember what they were for. Could you explain it to me?" And I heard the eagerness in his voice as he replied, "Oh, Eleanor, yes. Those are just some documents to help Rebecca manage things for you. You know, since your memory has been giving you trouble, it's really for your own protection." And I said, "Protection from what?" And he hesitated, clearly not expecting me to ask follow-up questions, and then he said, "Well, protection from making financial mistakes, or from people who might try to take advantage of you." And the irony of him saying this while actively planning to take advantage of me would have been funny if it weren't so cruel. And I continued, "But I have Patricia, my lawyer. She's always helped me with important decisions." And Mark's voice became sharper. "Patricia doesn't live with you. She doesn't see your daily struggles. Rebecca does, and she's family. Don't you trust your own daughter more than some lawyer?" And there it was, the manipulation tactic, making me feel guilty for trusting professionals over family, isolating me from my support system, and I said meekly, "I suppose you're right," and Mark, thinking he'd won, said, "Exactly, so when Rebecca brings those papers, again, just sign them, it'll make everything so much easier." And after I hung up, I immediately called Patricia and played her the recording, and she said, "Eleanor, this is textbook financial elder abuse. They're trying to isolate you from professional advisors. They're using familial guilt as manipulation, and they're attempting to rush you into signing legal documents without proper review. We have more than enough evidence now. We could move forward with legal action." But I said, "Not yet. Patricia, I want to see how far they'll go. I want the evidence to be so overwhelming that there's no possibility of them talking their way out of it or claiming it was a misunderstanding." The breaking point came 3 weeks later, when Rebecca brought Gordon Pike, her lawyer, back to the house with a new set of documents. And this time they weren't asking. Gordon said, "Mrs. Blackwood, we really need you to sign these papers today. They're power of attorney documents that will allow Rebecca to help you manage your affairs." And I looked at the papers, at the fine print I could read perfectly well despite my failing mind, and I saw that these weren't just basic power of attorney documents. They were comprehensive, irrevocable powers that would give Rebecca complete control over my finances, my medical decisions, even my living situation, essentially making me a ward of my own daughter. And there was a clause buried in page 7 that particularly caught my attention, a clause stating that once signed, these powers could not be revoked except by court order, meaning even if I changed my mind, even if I proved I was competent, I'd have to go through a lengthy legal battle to regain control of my own life. And I looked up at Gordon Pike with his predatory smile and Rebecca with her fake concern, and I felt something inside me shift. The performance was over. I'd gathered enough evidence, and it was time for the truth to come out. So I said in a voice completely different from the confused elderly woman I'd been playing, "No, I don't think I'll be signing these." And both Gordon and Rebecca looked shocked at the sudden clarity in my voice, and Rebecca said, "Mom, what?" And I held up my hand and said, "I'm not finished. I won't be signing these documents because I know exactly what they are. I know they would give you complete control over my life, and I know that's what you've wanted all along. Not because you care about my well-being, but because you want my money." And Rebecca's face went pale and she stammered, "That's not true. I'm just trying to help." And I opened the drawer of my desk and pulled out a folder, thick with printed transcripts and legal documents, and I said, "Would you like to hear yourself saying to Mark," and I quote, "Once she's declared incompetent, everything transfers to me, the house, the investments, all of it, and then we can finally buy that lake house." End quote. Would you like to hear that recording, Rebecca? And the color drained completely from her face and Gordon Pike stood up, suddenly looking nervous, and I continued, "Or perhaps you'd like to hear the recording from last Tuesday when you and Mark discussed staging incidents to make me appear incompetent, or the video footage I have of you deliberately turning on the stove and leaving it unattended, not once but twice, trying to create a fire hazard you could use as evidence that I'm a danger to myself." And Gordon Pike was already backing toward the door, clearly wanting nothing to do with this situation anymore. And Rebecca's mouth was opening and closing like a fish as she tried to find words. And I stood up, all 68 years of me, and I'd never felt more powerful, and I said, "I've already provided all of this evidence to my attorney, along with documentation of every attempt you made to manipulate my medical records, my bank accounts, my insurance policies, and my investments, and tomorrow morning, we're filing a complaint with the district attorney's office for attempted elder abuse, financial exploitation, and fraud." And Rebecca finally found her voice and screamed, "You can't do this, I'm your daughter." And I replied, "And I was your mother, the mother who raised you alone, who worked 2 jobs to put you through college, who gave you money whenever you needed it, who loved you unconditionally, and you repaid me by trying to steal my life." And Rebecca started crying, real tears this time, tears of fear and regret, and she said, "Mom, please, I'm sorry, Mark pressured me, he said we needed the money, I didn't want to." But I cut her off. "You had a choice at every moment, you chose this path, and now you'll face the consequences." And Gordon Pike literally ran from my house, and Rebecca collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing. And for just a moment, I felt my resolve waver, because despite everything, she was still my daughter, still the little girl I'd rocked to sleep and nursed through fevers and taught to ride a bicycle. But then I remembered the recording where she'd laughed about manipulating me, where she'd discussed putting me in the cheapest nursing home she could find, and my resolve hardened again. Within 24 hours, Patricia Thornton had filed all the necessary complaints, and the district attorney's office, which takes elder abuse cases very seriously, especially in our county, where there'd been several high-profile cases recently, opened an investigation immediately. And when the DA's investigators interviewed Dr. Harrison, Mr. Chun at the bank, my investment advisor, and my insurance agent, they all confirmed Rebecca's attempts to manipulate my affairs and provided their own documentation, and the case against her became airtight. Gordon Pike, trying to save himself and his law license, immediately turned over all his files on Rebecca and Mark, including emails where they'd discussed their plans in explicit detail, and he agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for reduced charges, and through his testimony, we learned the full scope of their plans. They'd already picked out the lake house they wanted to buy. They'd calculated the value of my estate down to the last dollar. They'd even discussed which nursing home they'd put me in once they had full control, the cheapest one they could find, because as Mark had said in one email, "She'll be out of it anyway, she won't know the difference." And reading those words, seeing how little my life meant to them, hurt more than all the manipulation combined. The investigation also revealed that this wasn't their first attempt at this kind of scheme. Mark had tried something similar with his own elderly aunt 3 years earlier, but she died before he could gain control of her finances, and now I wondered if Rebecca had known about that, if Mark had brought this experience to their marriage, if he'd taught her these manipulation tactics, or if she'd been a willing and eager student. And I realized it didn't matter anymore whose idea it had originally been, because Rebecca had made the choice to go along with it, to lie to doctors, to manipulate financial institutions, to plan my institutionalization, and those choices were hers alone. The legal proceedings took 6 months, and during that time, Rebecca tried everything to avoid consequences. She called me crying at least 3 times a week until I blocked her number. She sent letters begging forgiveness that I returned unopened. She showed up at my house with Mark, both of them pleading until I had to call the police to have them removed from my property. She even had her therapist call me suggesting I was being too harsh, and that Rebecca was having a mental breakdown from the stress, but I stood firm, not out of cruelty but out of necessity, because Patricia explained that if I showed any sign of forgiveness or reconciliation, it could weaken the case and might allow Rebecca to escape serious consequences, and I needed her to face real consequences, not for revenge, but so she'd understand that actions have costs, that you can't manipulate and exploit people, especially your own family, without facing justice, and also, selfishly, I needed her to face consequences so that I could begin to heal, because every day she avoided accountability was another day I couldn't start processing the grief of losing my daughter. During these months, I also discovered that Rebecca had been lying to extended family about the situation, telling my sister Margaret and my cousin Thomas that I was the one who'd become paranoid and cruel, that I'd falsely accused her of trying to help me, that I was punishing her for caring too much, and several family members actually called me to express their disappointment in how I was treating Rebecca, and I had to decide whether to explain the whole situation or just let them believe what they wanted, and ultimately I chose to send them each a carefully edited compilation of the recordings, just enough to show Rebecca's true intentions without exposing every painful detail, and the responses I got ranged from shock to apology to, in a few cases, silence, because some people couldn't reconcile the Rebecca they thought they knew with the Rebecca on those recordings. And I understood that feeling completely because I was still struggling with it myself. The DA offered Rebecca and Mark a plea deal after 4 months of investigation. Plead guilty to attempted financial exploitation of an elder, pay full restitution for any money they'd already taken, which turned out to be over $30,000 they'd somehow siphoned from my accounts through various small transactions I hadn't noticed. Complete 200 hours of community service working with elderly care organizations so they'd understand the vulnerability of the population they'd tried to exploit, and 5 years of probation with regular check-ins. And if they violated probation in any way, they'd face up to 3 years in prison. And after consulting with their lawyer, a different one since Gordon Pike had been disbarred for his role in the scheme and for violating attorney-client privilege by keeping evidence of their plans, Rebecca and Mark accepted the plea, probably because their attorney explained that if they went to trial, they'd almost certainly be convicted, given the overwhelming evidence, and would face much harsher sentences. And the day they stood in court and formally pleaded guilty, I sat in the gallery watching, Patricia beside me, and when the judge asked Rebecca, "Do you understand that you attempted to exploit your own mother for financial gain?" And Rebecca, crying, answered, "Yes, Your Honor." I felt not triumph but profound sadness that it had come to this, that my daughter had valued money more than our relationship, that she'd been willing to erase my identity, my competence, my very self, for a lake house and a bigger bank account, and sadness that I'd somehow failed as a mother, because surely I'd done something wrong in raising her. Surely I'd made mistakes that led to this moment. Though Patricia would later tell me, over wine in her office, that I needed to stop taking responsibility for Rebecca's choices, that adults make their own decisions and face their own consequences, and that some people are simply capable of betrayal regardless of how they were raised. After the sentencing, Rebecca tried to approach me outside the courtroom, Mark hanging back looking defeated and angry, and Rebecca reached for my arm, and I stepped back and she said through tears, "Mom, please, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm begging you, please don't cut me out of your life completely. I'll do anything, I'll go to therapy, I'll prove I've changed." And I looked at this woman who looked like my daughter but had become a stranger, and I said, "Rebecca, I want you to understand something. I forgive you, not because what you did was forgivable, but because carrying anger will only hurt me. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. You've lost the privilege of being in my life. You've lost your inheritance. I've rewritten my will, and everything goes to charities now. Organizations that help elderly people who've been abused by their families. Organizations that provide legal assistance to elders fighting exploitation. And you've lost your mother, not because I stopped loving you, because love isn't something I can just turn off, but because you destroyed the trust that makes a relationship possible. And without trust, we're just two people who share DNA and a painful history. And Rebecca collapsed onto the courthouse steps, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe, and Mark finally came forward and tried to say something, started to say, "Eleanor, you have to understand, we were desperate, we had debts." But I held up my hand and said, "I don't care about your excuses, Mark. Desperation doesn't justify cruelty. Debt doesn't justify exploitation, and your influence on my daughter, while significant, doesn't absolve her of responsibility for her own choices." And I walked away, walked to the parking lot where Patricia was waiting by her car, and she drove me home, and neither of us spoke during the drive because there was nothing left to say. The chapter was closed, justice had been served, and now I had to figure out how to live with the grief of it all. I sat in my study that night, the same study where I'd planned my counter-strategy 6 months earlier, and I looked at the voice recorder on my desk, the little device that had captured the truth and saved my life. And I thought about how different everything could have been if I hadn't followed my instincts that day in Dr. Harrison's office. If I'd just accepted Rebecca's narrative and let myself be slowly erased, declared incompetent, institutionalized, robbed of everything I'd worked for and ultimately robbed of myself, my identity, my autonomy, and I felt grateful, deeply grateful for my sharp mind that had recognized the manipulation, for my professional experience that had taught me to document everything, for the instinct that told me something was wrong even when my daughter was crying and professing concern, and I felt grateful for the people who'd helped me. Dr. Harrison, who'd seen through Rebecca's lies and conducted a fair evaluation. Mr. Chun at the bank, who'd protected my accounts and required proper procedures. Patricia, who'd built an ironclad legal case and supported me through every difficult decision. All the people who'd believed me and supported me when my own daughter was trying to convince everyone I was losing my mind. And I realized that while I'd lost my daughter, I'd gained a profound understanding of my own strength, my own worth, my own ability to fight for myself even when the opponent was someone I loved. Now, a year later, I'm still in my house, still sharp, still independent, still myself. I've become an advocate for elder abuse prevention, speaking at community centers and senior organizations, sharing my story so others can recognize the warning signs, learn to protect themselves, document suspicious behavior, and seek help before it's too late. And I've met dozens of people who've been through similar experiences. Children who tried to steal from aging parents, grandchildren who manipulated, elderly relatives, spouses who exploited partners with real cognitive decline, caregivers who isolated their clients and drained their accounts. And each story breaks my heart and strengthens my resolve to fight this invisible epidemic that affects hundreds of thousands of elderly people every year. People who often suffer in silence because they're ashamed, or because they don't want to believe their own family would hurt them, or because they've been successfully isolated from anyone who might help them. I never heard from Rebecca again directly, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that she and Mark divorced 2 years after the court case. Apparently the stress and shame of what they'd done, combined with the financial burden of restitution and legal fees, destroyed their marriage, and Rebecca moved to another state, trying to start over with the stain of her conviction following her, because elder abuse is a crime that shows up on background checks, affecting employment opportunities and housing applications, and sometimes late at night when sleep won't come. I wonder what she thinks about now, whether she regrets not just getting caught but the actual betrayal, whether she understands the magnitude of what she tried to do, whether she ever truly loved me, or whether I was always just an eventual inheritance in her eyes, whether there were moments during her childhood or young adulthood when she was genuine, or whether every interaction was colored by calculation. And I'll never know the answers to those questions, and maybe that's okay. Maybe some wounds don't need complete understanding to heal. Maybe it's enough to accept that it happened, that it hurt, that I survived, and that I'm stronger now than I was before. My advice to anyone watching this, anyone who has elderly parents or relatives, protect them, truly protect them, not by taking control but by empowering them to maintain their independence as long as possible. Encourage them to have regular legal and financial checkups. Help them understand their rights under elder protection laws. Make sure they know that accepting help doesn't mean surrendering control. And create an environment where they feel safe reporting suspicious behavior, even when That behavior comes from family members because the sad truth is that the vast majority of elder abuse comes not from strangers or professional caregivers, but from family members, from the very people who are supposed to love and protect their elderly relatives. And if you're an older person watching this, trust your instincts. If someone's behavior toward you changes suddenly, if someone becomes unusually interested in your finances, if someone starts suggesting you can't manage your own affairs, if someone tries to isolate you from friends or professional advisors, if someone rushes you to sign documents without giving you time to review them or consult your own attorney, document everything. Record conversations in states where one-party consent is legal and you feel comfortable doing so. Consult with professionals independently, and don't let anyone convince you that seeking outside advice is a betrayal of family, and don't let anyone gaslight you into believing you're less competent than you are. Your mind, your judgment, your autonomy matter, and you have the right to protect them. And there are resources available: adult protective services, elder law attorneys, local agencies on aging, support groups for elder abuse survivors. And you don't have to face this alone. I'm 69 now, another year older, another year wiser, and I live alone but not lonely. I have friends who've proven their loyalty. I have my advocacy work that gives me purpose. I have peace that comes from knowing I fought for myself and won. And most importantly, I have myself, my full self, my competent, sharp, independent self, not the confused, declining woman Rebecca tried to create, not the helpless victim she needed me to be. And every morning when I wake up in my own bed, in my own house, making my own decisions, managing my own finances, choosing how to spend my own time, I'm grateful that I trusted my instincts even when it meant suspecting my own daughter, grateful that I had the knowledge and resources to fight back, grateful that I live in a time and place where elder abuse is taken seriously by the legal system, and grateful that I'm free, truly free, to live the rest of my life on my own terms, and that freedom, that autonomy, that dignity is worth more than any inheritance, any relationship built on lies, any false peace that comes from ignoring betrayal and accepting mistreatment just to maintain the illusion of family harmony. 6 months after the court case concluded, something unexpected happened that gave me a new perspective on everything I'd been through. I received a letter, not from Rebecca, but from Mark's ex-wife, a woman named Jennifer who I'd never met, but who had divorced Mark years before he married my daughter. And in her letter, she explained that she'd seen news coverage of the court case and wanted me to know that I wasn't alone, that Mark had attempted something similar with her elderly father during their marriage, trying to convince Jennifer that her father needed a conservatorship and that Mark should be appointed as conservator since Jennifer was too emotional to make objective decisions, and Jennifer had almost fallen for it, had almost signed the papers, until her father's longtime accountant noticed irregularities and raised concerns, and that's what ultimately led to her divorce from Mark. And reading her letter, I realized that Rebecca had married a predator, someone who specifically targeted families with elderly members and assets, someone who had probably groomed my daughter over the years of their marriage, teaching her to see me not as a person, but as a financial resource to be exploited. And while this didn't excuse Rebecca's choices, it helped me understand the progression of how my loving daughter had become someone capable of such betrayal, and I wrote back to Jennifer, thanking her for reaching out, and we eventually met for coffee, and she told me more details about Mark's patterns, how he'd isolate his partners from their families, how he'd plant seeds of financial anxiety, how he'd slowly normalize the idea that taking control of elderly relatives' finances was not just acceptable, but necessary and even compassionate. And she said something that struck me deeply. She said, "Eleanor, your daughter was a victim too, not in the same way you were, but Mark victimized her by corrupting her values, by making her believe that betraying you was justified. And I'm not saying she's not responsible for her choices, she absolutely is. But I want you to know that the Rebecca you remember from before she married Mark, that person was probably real. And the person who tried to steal from you was what Mark molded her into." And I sat there in that coffee shop, tears streaming down my face, because Jennifer had given me something I didn't know I needed: context, a framework for understanding how my daughter had gone from the caring young woman who visited me weekly and called just to chat, to the calculating manipulator who plotted my institutionalization. And while it didn't change my decision to cut off contact with Rebecca, it did ease some of the self-blame I'd been carrying. The feeling that I must have failed as a mother to raise a child capable of such cruelty. Around the same time, I was contacted by a journalist named Michael Torres who was writing a series on elder abuse for a major newspaper, and he asked if I'd be willing to be interviewed about my experience. And initially I said no because I valued my privacy and didn't want to become a public figure. But Patricia encouraged me to reconsider, pointing out that my story had elements that could help so many people. The medical manipulation angle, the use of legal systems as weapons, the importance of documentation, the fact that I'd successfully fought back. And after much consideration, I agreed to the interview on the condition that certain details be changed to protect my privacy, and when the article came out, it was the centerpiece of a 3-part series on elder financial abuse, and the response was overwhelming. I received hundreds of letters and emails from people sharing their own stories. People thanking me for speaking out, people asking for advice on their own situations. And I realized that my painful experience had given me a platform to help others, and that maybe, just maybe, some good could come from all the hurt. Through the responses to that article, I connected with Dr. Sarah Chun, a gerontologist and researcher who was studying patterns in elder abuse cases, and she asked if I'd be willing to participate in her research and potentially speak at conferences about my experience. And I said yes, and over the next year, I found myself traveling to universities and professional conferences, speaking to social workers, attorneys, healthcare providers, and banking professionals about the warning signs they should watch for, the questions they should ask, the procedures they should follow to protect vulnerable clients. And it was during one of these speaking engagements that I met Harold, a 72-year-old widower whose son had successfully stolen nearly $500,000 from him before Harold realized what was happening. And Harold and I became close friends, bonding over our shared experience of family betrayal. And he introduced me to his support group for elder abuse survivors, and I started attending regularly, and in that group, sitting in a circle in a community center basement every Thursday evening, I found something I hadn't expected. A new family, not related by blood but bonded by shared trauma and mutual support. People who understood the unique pain of being betrayed by your own children or grandchildren. People who didn't judge me for cutting off contact with Rebecca. People who celebrated my strength instead of questioning my forgiveness. It was in that support group, about 18 months after the court case, that I met a woman named Dorothy who would become one of my closest friends. And Dorothy's story was even more heartbreaking than mine because her daughter had successfully gained control of her finances before Dorothy realized what was happening. And by the time Dorothy sought help, her daughter had sold Dorothy's house, liquidated her retirement accounts, and moved her into a nursing home where Dorothy was overmedicated and isolated from anyone who might help her. And it took Dorothy's granddaughter, who was away at college during the initial exploitation and only found out months later, to rescue her grandmother, hire an attorney, and fight for 2 years to undo the damage. And by the time Dorothy regained control of her life, she'd lost nearly everything except a small portion of her assets that the court managed to recover. And hearing her story made me realize how fortunate I'd been, how my instincts and quick action had saved me from a fate similar to Dorothy's. And it reinforced my commitment to advocacy work, because for every story like mine where the victim successfully fought back, there were dozens like Dorothy's where the abuse continued for years before being discovered, and hundreds more that were never discovered at all, where elderly people simply disappeared into the system, declared incompetent, isolated, exploited until their death, and no one ever knew what had been done to them. Through my advocacy work, I also learned disturbing statistics that the general public rarely hears. That financial exploitation of the elderly costs victims an estimated $2.9 billion annually in the United States alone, that only 1 in 44 cases is ever reported because of shame or fear or the victim's inability to report, that perpetrators are family members in approximately 60% of cases, and that victims of elder financial abuse are 4 times more likely to die prematurely compared to non-victims, not just from the stress but because the financial devastation often leaves them unable to afford proper health care, housing, or nutrition. And knowing these statistics, understanding the scope of this hidden epidemic, I felt not just a desire but a responsibility to keep speaking out, to keep sharing my story, to to keep pushing for better protections and stronger consequences for perpetrators. I also became involved in legislative advocacy, working with a coalition of elder rights organizations to push for stronger laws, and I testified before the state legislature about needed reforms. Mandatory training for bank employees to recognize signs of exploitation, stronger penalties for family members who exploit elderly relatives, better funding for adult protective services, clearer procedures for regaining competency status after it's been wrongly questioned, and streamlined processes for victims to recover stolen assets. And some of these reforms were actually passed into law, and knowing that my testimony and advocacy contributed to legal changes that would protect other elderly people gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since I retired from my consulting business, and it transformed my pain into something productive, something meaningful. On the 3-year anniversary of that day in Dr. Harrison's office, when Rebecca first tried to have me declared incompetent, I did something I'd been considering for months. I wrote Rebecca a letter, not to send but for my own closure. And in it I wrote everything I'd never been able to say in that brief exchange at the courthouse. I wrote about the specific moments in her childhood when I'd felt such overwhelming love for her that it physically ached. I wrote about the pride I'd felt watching her graduate college and start her career. I wrote about the hopes I'd had for our relationship as she got older, how I'd imagined us growing closer, how I'd looked forward to being a grandmother someday if she chose to have children. And then I wrote about the betrayal, not just what she'd done but how it made me feel, the specific moments that hurt the most. Finding out she'd laughed about manipulating me, learning she'd planned to put me in the cheapest nursing home available, discovering she'd seen me not as her mother but as an obstacle to wealth, realizing she'd been willing to erase my identity and autonomy for money. And I wrote about forgiveness, how I'd gotten there not for her sake but for mine, how I'd had to work through the anger and hurt and grief, how I'd had to accept that the daughter I thought I knew might never have existed, or if she had, she'd been lost long ago. And I wrote about hope, not hope for reconciliation because that bridge had been burned beyond repair, but hope that someday she'd truly understand what she'd done, that she'd feel genuine remorse not just for getting caught but for the act itself, that she'd become a better person even though I'd never know if she did. And after I finished writing, I read the letter aloud to myself, cried through most of it, and then I placed it in a fire-safe box along with all the recordings and documentation from the case, an archive of evidence and emotion that I might never look at again, but that needed to exist, physical proof that this all really happened, that I hadn't imagined or exaggerated the betrayal, that my response was justified and necessary. That same week, I had a follow-up appointment with Dr. Harrison, a routine checkup, and as he was reviewing my vitals and asking standard questions about my health, he paused and said, "Eleanor, I owe you an apology." And I looked at him confused, and he continued, "That first appointment with Rebecca, I should have been more skeptical. I should have insisted on speaking with you alone. I should have recognized the signs of potential exploitation, but I took her concern at face value. And if you hadn't been as sharp and proactive as you were, I could have been complicit in a terrible injustice." And I told him, "Dr. Harrison, Rebecca was very convincing. She fooled me for weeks before I understood what she was really doing. You saw her for 20 minutes, you had no reason to doubt her." But he shook his head and said, "That's exactly the problem. As healthcare providers, we need to be more vigilant. We need to always consider the possibility that concerned family members might not be acting in the patient's best interest, and since your case, I've completely changed my protocols. I now insist on speaking with elderly patients alone at least part of the time. I ask direct questions about whether they feel pressured or controlled. I provide information about resources and rights, and I've encouraged our entire medical practice to adopt these protocols." And hearing this, knowing that my experience had led to systematic changes that might protect other patients, brought tears to my eyes, because this was exactly the kind of impact I'd hoped for when I decided to speak publicly about what happened. Dr. Harrison then told me that he'd presented my case, with my permission and with all identifying information removed, at a medical conference on elder care, and the response had been significant, with many physicians admitting they'd never considered that a concerned family member might be fabricating or exaggerating symptoms for exploitative purposes. And now medical schools were beginning to include this topic in their geriatric medicine curriculum, teaching new doctors to watch for these warning signs, and to always verify information independently rather than taking family members' word at face value. And I left that appointment feeling that my suffering, Rebecca's betrayal, all of it had meaning beyond just my personal story. It was contributing to a broader awareness and systemic change. As I approached my 70th birthday, I found myself reflecting on how much my life had changed in just 3 years, how the trauma I'd experienced had paradoxically led to the most fulfilling period of my life. Because while I'd lost my daughter, I'd gained a community of survivors, a purpose through advocacy, close friendships with people like Harold and Dorothy and Patricia who truly understood me, and most importantly, I'd gained a deep confidence in my own strength and judgment that I'd never fully had before, because when you successfully fight off an attack from someone you love, when you trust your instincts even when everyone around you says you're being paranoid, when you stand up for yourself knowing it will cost you relationships, you prove to yourself that you're capable of protecting yourself, that you don't need anyone's permission to defend your own life, and that knowledge is powerful and liberating. For my 70th birthday, instead of the quiet dinner I might have had before, I organized a large celebration and fundraiser for the elder advocacy organization I'd become involved with, and over 200 people attended, including many of the survivors I'd met through my advocacy work, and seeing all these people together, sharing stories and supporting each other, I realized that Rebecca's betrayal had inadvertently led me to build something far more valuable than the inheritance she'd wanted to steal. I'd built a legacy of awareness and change. I'd built meaningful relationships based on shared purpose rather than blood obligation. I'd built a life that mattered not because of what I possessed, but because of what I contributed, and standing there in that crowded room, I felt more loved and valued than I had in years. Not by one person who was supposed to love me, but by hundreds of people who chose to respect and appreciate me for who I was and what I'd survived. About 6 months after that birthday celebration, I received another unexpected communication, this time from Rebecca herself, but not a direct message. Instead, I was contacted by her therapist with Rebecca's permission, asking if I'd be willing to participate in a family therapy session, and my first instinct was an immediate no, but the therapist explained that Rebecca had been in intensive therapy for over 2 years, working on understanding her actions and their impact, and that part of her recovery process involved making genuine amends to the people she'd hurt, not to seek forgiveness or reconciliation, but to take full accountability and provide closure. And after discussing it extensively with Patricia and with my support group, I agreed to one session, with specific conditions. It would be mediated by a neutral third-party therapist in addition to Rebecca's therapist. I would bring Patricia for support. We would meet in a professional setting not at either of our homes, and I reserved the right to leave at any time without explanation, and Rebecca agreed to all these conditions. The session took place on a cold Tuesday morning in November, in a therapist's office with 2 bright fluorescent lights and uncomfortable chairs, and when Rebecca walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. She'd aged dramatically in the 3 years since I'd last seen her. Her hair had gone prematurely gray, she'd lost significant weight, and there was something different in her eyes, a brokenness that hadn't been there before. And we sat across from each other with 2 therapists and Patricia present, and the mediating therapist explained the structure. Rebecca would speak first, sharing what she'd learned in therapy and taking accountability for her actions. Then I would have the opportunity to respond or ask questions or simply listen, and there would be no pressure for me to forgive or to commit to any future relationship. The goal was simply honest communication and closure. Rebecca began speaking in a voice so quiet we had to lean forward to hear, and she said, "Mom, I'm not here to make excuses or to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve forgiveness. I'm here because my therapist says that part of my healing requires me to fully acknowledge what I did to you and to hear from you how it affected you. And I want you to know that I understand now that what I did was evil. There's no other word for it. I conspired to steal your autonomy, your identity, your life, and I did it consciously and deliberately, and the reasons why don't matter because no reason could justify it." And she paused, tears streaming down her face, and continued, "In therapy, I've learned that I'd developed a kind of moral blindness where I'd convinced myself that the end justified the means, that once I had the money I'd use it for good things, so therefore the method of obtaining it wasn't that important. And I'd dehumanized you in my mind. I'd stopped seeing you as a person with feelings and rights and instead saw you as an obstacle or a resource, and Mark definitely encouraged this thinking. But I can't blame him entirely because I made my own choices. I could have said no at any point. I could have walked away, but I didn't, and I need to take full responsibility for that. And she went on to detail specific incidents, acknowledging each manipulation, each lie, each step of her plan. And it was painful to hear, but also validating because for 3 years part of me had wondered if maybe I'd overreacted, if maybe it hadn't been as bad as I remembered, but hearing Rebecca lay it all out in explicit detail confirmed that no, I hadn't exaggerated, it had been exactly as bad as I remembered, perhaps even worse because there were details she revealed that I hadn't known about, like how she'd contacted distant relatives trying to build a coalition of people who'd support declaring me incompetent, or how she'd researched memory care facilities with the goal of finding one that was cheap and had minimal oversight so she could institutionalize me and largely forget about me. When Rebecca finished speaking, the mediating therapist turned to me and asked if I wanted to respond, and I sat there for a long moment, looking at this stranger who used to be my daughter, and I realized that I had surprisingly little to say because Rebecca had already acknowledged everything. She'd taken responsibility, she'd validated my experience. And there was nothing I could add that would change what had happened or how I felt about it. So I simply said, "Thank you for being honest. Thank you for acknowledging what you did without minimization or excuse. And I want you to know that I meant what I said at the courthouse. I do forgive you. But that doesn't change the fact that you're no longer part of my life and won't be in the future. You killed our relationship as surely as if you'd killed me physically, and while I've rebuilt my life and found meaning and purpose and community, there will always be a hole where you used to be. Not because I haven't healed, but because you were my daughter, and that bond, even broken, leaves a mark." And Rebecca nodded, crying harder now, and said, "I understand, and I don't expect anything from you. I just want you to know that I think about what I did every single day. It haunts me, and I'm trying to become a better person, not to earn your forgiveness because I know that's not possible, but because I need to live with myself. And the only way I can do that is to ensure I never hurt anyone like this again." And then she asked, "Can I tell you one thing, just one memory I've been holding on to?" And I nodded, and she said, "I remember when I was 7 and I fell off my bike and broke my arm, and you drove me to the hospital even though you were terrified of driving in bad weather, and it was storming that day, and you held my good hand the entire time the doctor set my broken arm, and you told me I was brave and strong. And when we got home you let me sleep in your bed that night because I was scared, and I remember feeling so safe, so loved, so certain that you would always protect me. And I want you to know that memory is real, your love for me was real, and somewhere along the way I forgot the value of that love. I took it for granted and then I betrayed it, but it was real, and I'm grateful I had it even though I destroyed it." And hearing this broke something open inside me that I'd been holding closed, and I started crying. Not gentle tears but deep sobs, because yes, that memory was real. I did love her that much. I would have done anything for her. I did do everything for her, and she'd thrown it all away for money, and the waste of it, the senseless, tragic waste of a relationship that could have been beautiful, overwhelmed me. The session ended shortly after that because I couldn't continue. I was too emotionally raw, and Patricia drove me home and stayed with me that evening, and we talked about the session, about Rebecca's apologies and admissions, about whether I'd made the right choice in attending, and Patricia said something wise. She said, "Eleanor, there's no right or wrong here, there's just what you needed for your own healing, and if hearing Rebecca take full accountability helped you, then it was the right choice, and if it stirred up pain that you'd successfully moved past, then you'll work through that pain again and you'll still be okay." And I realized she was right. The session hadn't changed my decision about maintaining no contact with Rebecca, but it had given me something I didn't know I needed. Confirmation that the loving mother-daughter relationship I remembered from Rebecca's childhood had been real, not a delusion, not wishful thinking, but genuine, and while that didn't excuse what Rebecca had done as an adult, it did help me separate the child I'd loved from the adult who'd betrayed me. And that separation made it easier to hold on to the good memories without feeling like my entire relationship with Rebecca had been a lie. In the weeks following that therapy session, I had vivid dreams about Rebecca as a child, memories I hadn't thought about in years surfacing in my sleep. Teaching her to read, helping her with school projects, attending her dance recitals, celebrating her small victories, and comforting her through disappointments. and I woke from these dreams with bittersweet emotions. Grief for the loss, but also gratitude that these experiences had happened, that for 18 years I'd had a daughter I loved and who seemed to love me back, and even though it ended in betrayal, those 18 years were real and meaningful, and no one could take those memories from me or diminish their value. Now, as I approach my 71st birthday, I find myself in a place of hard-won peace. I live in my beautiful home that I worked 40 years to afford, and that no one can take from me. I manage my own finances with the help of trusted professionals who've proven their integrity. I spend my days doing advocacy work that gives me purpose. I have genuine friendships based on mutual respect and shared values. I have the respect and gratitude of countless people I've helped through my speaking and advocacy, and I have myself, my full autonomous self, not diminished or controlled or manipulated by anyone, and that is a gift beyond measure. A gift I very nearly lost and now treasure with conscious gratitude every single day. And while there's still a daughter-shaped hole in my life, and probably always will be, I've learned that you can be both wounded and whole at the same time. That you can grieve what you lost while celebrating what you've gained. That survival itself can be a form of triumph. And that sometimes the family we build through shared experience and chosen connection is more valuable than the family we're born into. And I hope my story helps someone else who's facing similar betrayal, helps them trust their instincts, helps them understand they have the right and the power to protect themselves even when the threat comes from family, helps them know that life after betrayal is possible, that healing is possible, that meaning and purpose and even joy are possible because yes, Rebecca tried to steal my life, but she failed. I'm still here, still strong, still myself, and I will continue to be here, living on my own terms for as long as this life allows. And that, more than any legal victory or financial security or public recognition, is the ultimate triumph. The proof that no matter how much someone tries to diminish you or control you or erase you, if you fight back, if you trust yourself, if you refuse to surrender your autonomy, you can win, you can survive, you can thrive, and you can use your pain to help others, turning your trauma into purpose, your suffering into strength, your betrayal into a testimony of resilience that might light the way for someone else walking through their own darkness. And that is why I continue to share this story, painful as it is, necessary as it has become. Because if even one person hears it and recognizes the warning signs in their own life, if even one person finds the courage to protect themselves because they heard how I protected myself, then every moment of pain, every hour of fear, every day of grief, will have served a purpose larger than my individual suffering, and that makes it bearable, that makes it meaningful, that transforms my victimization into victory not just for myself but for everyone who comes after, everyone who might be saved because I spoke up, because I refused to be silenced by shame or fear or family loyalty, because I chose truth over comfort, justice over peace, myself over the daughter who tried to steal me, and I would make that same choice again, as painful as it was, because the alternative, letting her succeed, losing myself, becoming the confused, helpless woman she wanted me to be, would have been a death worse than physical death. And I chose life, I chose myself, and I will keep choosing myself every day for the rest of my days because I am Eleanor Blackwood. I am 70 years old, I am sharp and strong and free, and no one, not even my own daughter, will ever take that away from me again. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.